Well, it's good to be here, and welcome. I'm speaking on behalf of the Cornwall Creation Group. We're a group of people with PhDs in science, largely, and interest in science, and available to speak around the county about creation issues. And so this is part of that. Just to introduce myself a bit more, my background is a PhD in microbiology at Warwick University. Then I went into further postdoctoral research for about 7 years in marine microorganisms, viruses, bacteria, algae, microscopic algae. So that's where I was for about 10 years at Warwick University. And then I left there, I went to Bible College for a couple of years training, and then I went into the ministry. I was a pastor up in Yorkshire for 8 years, and now in Truro for the last 4. So that's a bit about myself. But here we are looking at this theme this morning of Genesis and in the light of science. Now, Christians and atheists alike acknowledge that there is a clear conflict then between evolutionary theory on the one hand and a plain literal reading of the early chapters of Genesis, of creation in 6 literal days, apparently just a few thousand years ago. Not to mention of a literal Adam and Eve, human lifespans of over 900 years, and a global flood. That doesn't fit with contemporary scientific theories. So, is science wrong, or is the Bible wrong? Or have we misunderstood the early chapters of Genesis? Or have we misunderstood science? Now, my aim today is to try to combine both a look at science with a look at the scriptures, though separating into 2 distinct talks. Now, I'll lay my cards on the table at the start in case you haven't already guessed, being organised by the Cornwall Creation Group. But I personally am convinced that both the science and the Bible together point us to a special creation event just a few thousand years ago, young Earth creation. Now, I want to stress that I have not always believed that. I grew up being convinced of evolution and held to evolution even when I began my science career at university with that view of evolution. I became a Christian at university, but still held to evolution for a couple of years. But I want to confess, and it is a confession, that as a Christian, that the reason that I changed my view was not through studying the Bible. That's my confession. I wish it were the studying the Bible, but it's my sad confession. Rather, it's because I was confronted with the science that challenged me. Now, from my own experience, I think that the greater barrier to accepting young Earth creation is not that I think the Bible persuades me of evolution, the Bible persuades me of an old Earth, but it's supposed science tells me that. And so my sad confession, which I suspect is true for many evangelical Bible-based Christians, is that we are more influenced by contemporary science than by the Bible. I think that's sad. But I also think it's a reality, and that's why I want to begin by examining the science. The question is, do the scientific data themselves lead you to believe in evolution and an old Earth? Now clearly, the atheist scientists will say, well, absolutely. But do their claims stand up to scrutiny? So what does the science actually say in our first talk? Now, does this work? Good. First point. I want to just point out that there are flaws in the Big Bang and evolution theories. Firstly, there are cosmological problems. One is of dark matter and energy. Now, astrophysicists say that 95% of all the matter in the universe is made up of what's called dark matter and dark energy, which has not been seen, has not been detected. That's why it's called dark. To all the stars, all the planets, and all the black holes as well, that we can see and detect, they are only responsible for 5% of what's out there, apparently. Now, the reason for that conclusion is the observations of the movement of the stars given the Big Bang theory. So in order for the Big Bang to work, they say the stars are moving away too fast, too quickly, that there needs to be some energy to overcome gravity. There needs to be this dark energy. Similarly, in order to understand how stars were formed, assuming that we reject the notion that God simply created them by His Word, then we need dark matter, we need dark energy. The only trouble is, there's no evidence for it. The Big Bang theory and evolutionary theory of star formation all require that 95% of all matter and energy is stuff that has not been detected, and there's no evidence for. Or to put it another way, The theory does not match the scientific observations. Maybe the theory isn't actually correct then. Spiral galaxies. I read about this conundrum in a book on astrophysics from the late 1980s, but I questioned a top astrophysicist recently who I met from Leicester University who works on exoplanets. And he said that it's still an unsolved conundrum. Why do you see the spiral in spiral galaxies? This kind of wisp of the stars. It's like swirling cream in a coffee. Why do you see that? If the galaxies are billions of years old, then the galaxies, these are rotating. They should have rotated plenty of times already, and the spiral arms should have already wound up. So you shouldn't see the spiral arms anymore, much as the cream mixes into the coffee, and you no longer see the swirl. So the fact that you can still see the swirl in the spiral galaxies gives the impression that they are not billions of years old. Secondly, there are universalist assumptions for dating techniques. One of the common arguments of an old Earth of 4.5 billion years is that dating techniques tell you that. But do they? Actually, all dating techniques, like all science, involve assumptions. And the great assumption that we ought to seriously question is that of universalism. In other words, that things have always been as they are today. Processes and rates today are the same as they have always been. Now, some of those assumptions, like the speed of light, may be valid, although it's difficult to prove that. But they all assume that there has been no catastrophic global flood that deluged the entire world. So, radiometric dating. Rocks are dated by the relative amounts of the elements potassium and argon, because radioactive potassium decays into argon. But that assumes, though, this dating technique assumes that we know how much potassium and argon was in the rock when it was first formed. And it also assumes that none has been removed or added, other than by radioactive decay from the potassium to the argon. And yet, a global flood might seem to invalidate that assumption, and therefore to scupper the technique. In fact, potassium-argon dating of rocks that came out of volcanic eruptions within the last century, those dates have shown dates of millions of years, suggesting that the assumption that we knew how much potassium and argon were there at the start, that may well be unjustified. Richard Dawkins, in his book Evidence for Evolution, The Greatest Show on Earth is a big title, he claims that the fact that there are different radiometric techniques using different elements, that they produce the same ages, that fact suggests the techniques and dates are reliable. Well, yeah, certainly that sounds convincing, doesn't it? The trouble is, it's not true. Different techniques actually produce wildly different dates, actually. Even the same technique on different minerals in the same rock sample gives wildly different dates. And in any case, whatever elements are used, they all have those same assumptions that the Bible would say are invalid. Similarly, carbon dating of organisms rather than rocks. Carbon dating assumes that the two isotopes, carbon-12 and carbon-14, that they were in equilibrium, mixed together well when the organism was living. But carbon-14 is formed by cosmic rays interacting with atmospheric nitrogen. And so it will take time then from the creation of the atmosphere for carbon-12 and carbon-14 to reach equilibrium. It will take a long time. In an old Earth, it's a fair assumption that equilibrium had been reached by the time the creature lived and died. No problem with that. But not if the Earth is as young as the Bible seems to suggest. In which case, carbon dating would give you artificially old ages. Continental drift, next. We know South America and Africa are used to be joined together, but they're now 3,000 kilometres apart. Now, because they are currently moving away at 2 centimetres per year, therefore scientists assume that it's taken at least then, mathematically, 150 million years for that to happen. That they have always been moving so slowly. But the global flood described in Genesis describes massive upheavals in the Earth's crust with potentially much more rapid rates of continental drift. Sedimentation. Sediment currently forms at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean at 0.2 millimetres per year, and so sedimentary rocks are dated on that basis. So 1 kilometre depth of sedimentary rock must have taken 5 million years to form. But the Bible tells us there was a global flood. Well, wouldn't that have deposited vast amounts of sediment much more rapidly? In other words, don't trust the dating techniques that say the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. If the Bible's account is correct, then their assumptions are up the spout, and so their dates will be very, very wrong. Well, next, there are fossil explosions when you start looking at the fossil evidence. This was recognised by Charles Darwin as a big problem for evolutionary theory. It's called Darwin's dilemma. More broadly speaking, there are a lack of intermediate fossils, where one creature slowly evolves into another, as the theory says. There's a lack of those intermediates. It's known today by evolutionists as punctuated equilibrium. That doesn't actually fix the problem, it just identifies it. Evolutionary theory predicts that intermediates will be found. And Darwin got around it by saying that, well, fossil hunting was still in its infancy in his day, and these intermediates would one day be found. But 150 years on, and they still haven't. Now, sure, there are notable exceptions that you would have heard, like horse fossils, but they are the exception. As has been pointed out by others, most major groups of animals appear abruptly in the fossil record, fully formed, and with no fossils yet discovered that form a transition from their parent group. They're suddenly there, without any sort of gradual evolution into that, in the fossil record. Now that's particularly noticeable at what you might have heard of, the Cambrian explosion. It's at a point in the fossil record where suddenly you've got a huge array of novel, complex organisms appearing, with a lack of transitional intermediate fossils beforehand, further down the geologic column. Suddenly you've got all these different forms of life. And it's not just the Cambrian explosion, but there's also a tertiary explosion. There's an explosion of birds, there's an explosion of four-footed land animals, there's an explosion of insects, and there are others too. In general, then, the fossil data contradict the evolutionary model of the gradual appearance of complex organisms. Next, universal common descent does not fit the data. So, briefly, the idea of Darwin's tree of life, where all creatures today have a single common origin, common ancestor. That idea does not fit the evidence. Different methods of assessing ancestry, whether you use DNA methods or physiological methods of the proteins and what a body looks like, you use different methods. They result in different trees. And even using DNA methods with different genes as your target, it will end up with different trees. A paper in the evolutionary journal, Trends in Genetics, a good secular journal, in 2009, suggested that there might be multiple lines of descent. In other words, that the data do not fit this standard evolutionary model. And then evolution today always involves genetic loss. The whole model of evolution is that organisms grow. They grow in their DNA content over time. So humans have more genes than the first single cells that supposedly evolved. Organisms have ever since been evolving new genes in order to develop new features in their biochemistry or in their body plan. But the trouble is there's no evidence for that. Rather, the reverse. Evolution that's observed in nature, as organisms adapt to their changing environment through natural selection, that always involves genetic loss, not gain. In other words, for example, genes are lost that enable maybe a microbe to tolerate some toxin. Genes are lost because now it can't metabolize that toxin, and so it's not killed by it. So it's evolved on this minute level. Now, Richard Dawkins, his big argument is that microevolution, on this natural selection, adaptation, where one species changes and adapts, that is proof of macroevolution, changing ultimately to a completely different species. But that is a huge extrapolation with no evidence. Matt Leigh-Soller, a professor emeritus of bioprocess engineering at Helsinki University, points out that DNA mutations are invariably negative, outweighing positive mutations by a factor of 1,000 to 1,000,000. Far more negative mutations than positive. And even the positive beneficial, supposedly beneficial mutations, always involve a loss of function. So bacteria that have evolved antibiotic resistance, the reason they've become antibiotic resistant is because they have become deficient in their ordinary metabolism. And they would be outcompeted by unmutated bacteria. They can't work on the normal substrates or normal things that they eat, that they grow on. and they will be outcompeted by the other bacteria. And so what that means is that the vast majority of mutations do not fix in a population, but they are lost eventually. In real life, in other words, rather than in evolutionary models, all genomes are genetic content. All genomes degenerate. Leisona points out that life's direction is degeneration, not evolution. Similarly, Jonathan Wells, a doctor in molecular biology, looked into developmental biology research on fruit flies, mice and zebrafish, and he observed that mutations in experiments on animals are never beneficial. They always result either in the animal overcoming the mutation and developing normally, or the animal being born deformed or dead. So the idea then that creatures can evolve positively into better, more complex, more advanced organisms, it just does not fit the science. Organisms within a species, yes, they adapt to their environment and they can do so in just a few generations, but always with genetic loss. They are genetically inferior to their ancestors. They're not superior, they're inferior. Well, next, let's look at folded proteins. Evolutionary theory then says that proteins evolve gradually. These chains of amino acids, they fold up into, although they're these long chains, they fold up into a three-dimensional structure to be of use in its particular function. Now, without folding them, without the protein chain folding, it would be a useless chain. But there are so many possible combinations of amino acid sequences that in any chain. And Douglas Axe, who's a molecular biologist at Cambridge University, he's shown that only a tiny fraction of those possible sequences would fold, let alone folding into something useful. In fact, to get a single protein of only 150 amino acids, which is actually a very small protein, to get a single protein of 150 amino acids, to search through all the possible combinations to get a single fold, you would need way more organisms than have ever lived in all evolutionary history. He reckons you would need 10 to the power of 77 organisms, and only 10 to the power of 40 have ever existed, so way more. And then add to that all the millions of proteins that there are, and proteins that are much longer than 150 amino acids, and add to that the fact that you've got some viruses that produce 3 different fully functional proteins from the same stretch of DNA by using different reading frames. And you put all that together, and mathematically, the evolution of functional proteins is just unbelievably too improbable. At a molecular biological level, the idea of proteins evolving, even over 4.5 billion years, is utterly absurd. You'd need trillions upon trillions of years. Now, there has to be another way proteins came into existence. Evolution is a totally inadequate theory. So that's flaws in Big Bang and evolution. Next, let's look at evidence for young Earth creation. And firstly, there is DNA and blood vessels in fossils. So back in 2007, the evolutionary scientist, Mary Schweitzer, which she caused a stir when she cracked open a fossilized T-Rex bone, dated at 75 million years old, and discovered stretchy blood vessels and what looked like red blood cells, as you can see in the slide there, and evidence of DNA. But DNA has a half-life of about 520 years. Bonds between the links in the chain of DNA are broken by cosmic background radiation. So all the DNA in a fossil bone should have been destroyed after about 7 million years. Well, her conclusion was that the present models of fossilization processes may be incomplete. Well, perhaps a better conclusion is that the fossils are not as old as 75 million years. Next, carbon-14 is routinely found in coal and dinosaur fossils. Radioactive carbon has a half-life of 5,700 years. So after 100,000 years, there should be no carbon-14 detectable. It should all have decayed. And yet, creation scientists sending samples off to secular laboratories have routinely found carbon-14 in coal and dinosaur fossils, suggesting that coal and fossils are not millions of years old, not even as much as 100,000 years if you can find carbon-14 there. Now, critics say it's contamination, just contamination, but the samples were subjected to rigorous conditions, so it's very unlikely. More likely is that they really are not that old. something called polystrate fossils. Fossilised tree trunks, 10 metres long, have been found, which cut through sedimentary rock strata, which is supposedly then, what, 50,000 years old. Really? A tree lasting for 50,000 years without decay? Maybe more likely the sediment was laid down rapidly in some big flood. Fossils of large dinosaurs. Likewise, the fact that large dinosaurs are found fossilised points to rapid burial under vast quantities of sediment, not the gradual covering of 0.2 millimetres per year. Even evolutionary scientists acknowledge that. A huge nodosaur was in the news a few years ago, beautifully preserved. And the authors of the paper pointed out that it had to have been buried in a flood, otherwise it wouldn't have been preserved by that, it would have been rotted away. But what about being preserved in the flood? In fact, in 2014, a couple of secular scientists published in a secular science journal worked on dead crocodiles. And they showed that for a reptile the size of a crocodile to be buried in sediment with its skeleton intact, it needed to be buried rapidly by at least 20 centimetres of sediment. Otherwise, it would, if it's not buried down, it will bloat as it rots, it will float to the surface, it will get scavenged, and then when it does eventually settle, its bones will all be out of place because it's been scavenged. And yet, the fluvial geomorphologist Ron Nello works on river sediments. He points out that such flood conditions that deposit 20 centimetres of sediment are extremely rare these days. And so the very presence then of well-preserved skeletons of huge dinosaurs with their bones in place, dinosaurs much bigger than crocodiles, suggests that they were buried under huge amounts of sediment from an utterly catastrophic flood. Now all of that then is just to give you a sample of the vast amount of science that is now confirming young Earth creation. And what I'm trying to do in this first talk then is to show that there is a difference between scientific fact and scientific theory. Evolutionists would like to say that evolution is so clearly evident that it is fact, not just theory. But hopefully you can see that just is not the case. Now you can't argue with the facts, but you can argue about the theory. And you can argue about the interpretation of the facts. Scientists are not infallible. They are not untouchable experts. They get things wrong. They misinterpret the data. They ignore some important data, thinking that it's erroneous. Scientific theories change. The theory of evolution is still itself evolving. As Wayne Grudem concludes in his book on theistic evolution, from the science surrounding evolution, he says, let's just read this, much recent scientific research, rather than supporting current evolutionary accounts, in reality exposes significant challenges to evolutionary explanations of the origin and diversity of life. The scientific evidence suggests that no biblical scholars should feel compelled by the scientific evidence to interpret Genesis in a way that presupposes the truth of a neo-Darwinian macroevolutionary theory. In other words, when you truly consider the science, there is no reason to feel you need to accept evolutionary theory. And speaking as a scientist who knows what goes on in the realm of science, I would strongly urge every Christian to be extremely sceptical of so-called scientific facts when they contradict the Bible. Now, our next session is going to be aiming at examining just what the Bible says on this issue, but that's it for this one on science. But I want to point you to two books in particular. This one on theistic evolution, a scientific, philosophical, and theological critique. Various different authors. There are Wayne Grudem's involved, but in particular there are 9 chapters in this on scientific reasons to reject evolutionary theory. The authors, 9 PhD scientists, they don't necessarily believe in a young Earth. In fact, I don't think any of them do. Well, I'm not sure about that, but they don't necessarily believe that. But they do reject evolution for scientific reasons. So there's good science in there. The second one is evolution's Achilles' heels. Again, 9 PhD scientists, different from the scientists in the other book, from 2014, which theistic evolution came out in 2017. This one gives good scientific reasons to accept a young Earth creation. Good science stuff. There are other books up here which belong to me, so please don't take them. But there's stuff at the back which I think the magazines are free to take, and books I think can be purchased. But you can see what's around anyway.